What remained up for debate until the 20th century was why evolution? Why do life forms change over time? That was the key debate in the second half of the 19th century. This man settled that debate, Charles Darwin. And Darwinian evolution became the guiding principle of 20th century science. What did Darwin say? Well, Darwin started his observations as a naturalist on the HMS Beagle, Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle, 1832 to 1837. He was already wide read, right? He had trained to be an Anglican priest. So he was trained in theology, he was trained in philosophy, but he was also trained as a naturalist, someone who would go out and observe and record nature. Now, this was important for the Queen because her navy needed food and provisions around the world. Right? In the 19th century, the sun never set on the British Empire. There were still parts of the world that Europeans were completely ignorant about. And so European navies wanted to find out what food, what animals their sailors could eat as they moved around the world, because this is a time with limited refrigeration, limited capacity. The only thing you could do with meats was to salt them. That then leads to the problem of scurvy. So then you have to have citruses to try to fight scurvy so you can have vitamin C. It's much better to have a fresh food supply. So they hired people like Darwin to go study and look for plants and animals. He made his big observation on the Galapagos Islands. He found and studied finches and tortoises. Finches are birds, tortoises are a shelled land animal. And what he noticed was variation that should not be there. He found different varieties of finches on different islands. In other words, all the islands didn't have the same finches. He found different tortoises on different islands. All the islands didn't have the same tortoises. Now, if you look at the map, you'll see that the Galapagos Islands are incredibly situated as an experiment. They're far enough away from any landmass that there's not going to be a lot of interspecies exchange with these islands, right? There's not going to be a lot of mating. It's also at the equator, so there's not a lot of temperature variation on these islands, right? So you got a constant temperature, a pretty much enclosed environment. These are things that scientists try to recreate in the lab. Darwin stumbles upon them in nature. And the prevailing scientific theory at the time, right, was that climate drove evolution. That climate drove species change. Right? Why do you have polar bears in the north? Because it's cold and it's icy and they need white. Why are there brown bears in the woods? Because they're hanging out in the woods, right? So climate drives species change. Well, Darwin said, if that were true, if climate were the driving force of species change, why were there variations from islands to island? If climate were the driving force in evolution, then the finches and the tortoises should all be the same. They weren't. So Darwin then questioned, well, if climate's not the driving force, what was? And so Darwin then spent the rest of his life after the Beagle trying to explain what he saw, what he observed on the Galapagos Islands. And his explanation becomes the answer for modern biology, that not only that species change over time, but Darwin then explained why species change over time. The origin of the species was not arguing the fact of evolution, right? The fact of evolution was already established. Life forms change over time. What Darwin was able to do is offer a reasonable explanation of why life forms change over time. And he started with an understanding of Malthus, right? Thomas Malthus made a big splash in the early 19th century by looking at human population, and he had a very big impact on social policy that lasted into the 20th century. And Malthus made a very simple assertion that food supply increases at an arithmetic rate, while population increases at a geometric rate. Yeah. That's great. So what does that mean? Well, if we put down a simple arithmetic equation, we put 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, that's 10. But if we look at geometric rate, that's 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 equals 24. So what conclusion can somebody then reach if this is, a natural law of reproduction? The simple conclusion is that populations will always overwhelm food supply. That animal populations, and in this case, what he was worried about human population. And for him, the conclusion then is you don't feed poor people, because if you feed them, they're going to breed. And if you breed, it's going to collapse society. So the best thing to do is never feed a poor person. So maybe another way of looking at this is if you do a, simple Excel chart and with a pivot graph on it. So on the column A and the column B, right, 2 different series, right, you'll see what happens as we go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, right? The same numbers, but a different either arithmetic equation or a geometric equation. And hopefully you can see there that the blue line is food supply and that the yellow line is the population. Eventually, what's going to happen if you keep going out, that population will keep going up and somebody's going to starve, right? So what this means then is that there's a constant competition for food. That even within a species, there is never enough food for all of the members of the species to survive. That was how Darwin applied it, not simply to humans and public policy, but what was going on in the Galapagos Islands. That led him to a process he called natural selection. Natural selection explained evolution. Darwin observed that there is a chance variation of offspring. You may look like your brother, you may look like your sister, you may look like more like your mom, you may look like more like your dad, but species do not clone themselves, right? That if you look around through sexual reproduction, that the offspring is going to be a little bit different than the parents. that there's some type of chance variation. Now, later on in the 19th century, after Darwin, Mendel starts understanding genes, and genes, right, the theory of genes fit into this. But Darwin doesn't know about that yet. Darwin opens the door to thinking differently about biology. And so what he says then is that all of the offspring are then going to compete for food. Now, we like to think of the nice little story where mom's going to feed everybody and dad's going to feed everybody and everybody's going to be hunky-dory and get together. No, no, no. Right? Parents will always have more offspring than they can feed. Over time, species have more population to feed, which means there's going to be a competition for food. Some people are going to, or some offspring are going to get more food, some offspring are going to get less. That competition for food then determines lifespan. Offspring that get more food live longer. Offsprings that don't get more food die sooner. So what this means then for any particular individual is more food enables higher reproduction. Species or an individual that lives longer is going to have more sex, and if they have more sex, they have more babies. How do you live longer? You have more food. So the lifespan of individuals varies depending upon food supply. If you have less food, that hinders reproduction. So this was the mechanism for passing on traits from one generation to the next. In going from one generation to the next, there's going to be a chance variation. In that chance variation, if it enabled greater access to food, you have longer life. Longer life means more reproductive, and then that quality will be passed on to the next generation. If that chance variation hinders food acquisition, that particular individual is going to die off. They're not going to have enough sex. They don't have as much sex. They have fewer offspring. This simple mechanism provides the basis for explaining how life forms change over time. In species with very high reproductive rates, you can actually watch or see the variations and changes over time. In species with slow reproductive rates, right, it's much harder to see. So it's harder to see in humans, it's harder to see in elephants. But if you look at things like a virus, like COVID-19, right, its life cycle is very short, its reproductive is really fast, right? That virus is out there trying to find places to eat and reproduce. And when it finds places to eat and reproduce, it does it really fast. When it doesn't find places it can eat and reproduce, it dies off. But every time it reproduces, it mutates. This gets translated into popular culture by the survival of the fittest, right? This was not a Darwinian term, but it gets applied to Darwin. And so there's lots of misconceptions about what this means. So some people would say, well, this is survival of the strongest. Yeah, not really. Because we can take Darwinian principles and apply it to one of the largest extinction events in world history. What's one of the biggest extinction events that you know of in world history? Meteor that killed the dinosaurs, right? So we've got in the fossil record these big, huge creatures, right? And they dominate the planet. And they fascinate little kids. Right? I mean, you've got to admit, you walk into a natural history museum and you see a skeleton of a T-Rex and you go, oh my. Why were these creatures able to become so large? Well, paleontologists then go look at the food supply. The plant life on Earth was called megafauna, right? Big plants. And so that big plants supported bigger animals. Like what we call a brontosaurus, right? Fred Flintstone ate a brontosaurus bird. It was a plant eater. That meteor comes down, it smashes into the earth, throws up all this dust, rapidly cools the earth, the megafauna dies, and with that, the dinosaurs that we know of in museums go extinct. But is that true? Did all of the dinosaurs go extinct? Are there any offspring of dinosaurs still alive today?
Yes.
What are they?
Like crocodiles and alligators.
Crocodiles now, right? Much smaller, right? And there's even another one that most people don't recognize as a direct descendant of dinosaurs.
If you're talking about a chicken, it sort of is, but it's also not. I mean, it's related to the avian dinosaurs and kind of related to T-Rexes, but it's not like an actual direct descendant of them.
No, chickens aren't, but the rest of the birds are, right? So no, chicken. I would have never thought of you pulling out a chicken, but chickens
I've heard that argument a couple of times, so that's
yeah. The chicken itself is not. It's actually domesticated from a wild bird from Southeast Asia. But if you go the other direction, where you go into the wild bird populations, because paleontologists now know, right? So what comes first, the chicken or the egg? The answer is the egg. Eggs first evolved in dinosaurs, and feathers first evolved in dinosaurs. There were dinosaurs with feathers. Probably the benefit of feathers is what you see birds today in the winter. Right today, if you go outside, you're going to see birds that are like real fluffy because they're trying to stay warm. Dinosaurs, if they stayed warm, right, that was a beneficial quality. But the point here is for a long period of time, big was okay because there's lots of food, but then very rapidly, small becomes the preference because there's less food. And it's not only the smaller dinosaurs that survived this extinction event, but what other type of animal then comes to dominate the planet because of the difference in food? What other animal gets more food and then is able to reproduce and develop into a whole host of other species?
Humans?
Oh, humans are much later, but what are humans a type of? Right? If we draw a big old circle, right? Obviously, humans are later going to come into there. You know, humans are
Hominids.
Ryan, what did you say?
Hominids.
Hominids. So if we go back, if we draw a bigger circle, there are hominids, and humans are a type of hominid. Yes, that is there. But even hominids are a type of another type of animal.
Mammal?
Mammals. Yeah, right. If we have a big old circle, it's mammals. Right? They have internal gestation. They feed their young milk. Right. All of these things are mammals. Cows are mammals. Horses are mammals. Goats are mammals. Sheep are mammals. Right. All different types of mammals. Humans are just part of that. But all of them have a common ancestor with a little bitty rodent. Right. So small rodent, like mouse type creatures, survived the extinction event of the dinosaurs because they're small, they're warm blooded, they don't eat as much, and that allows them to create a niche and evolve. And as they get food and as they reproduce, their offspring have chance variation, and there's going to be a variety of changes. This Darwinian explanation, right? This Darwinian explanation is the explanation that scientists still use. Obviously, there's going to be modifications between Darwin and the present, but the basic idea remains unchanged and unchallenged. Darwinian evolution provides the explanation of why species change over time. There's a competition for food. Some offspring have a chance variation to get that food, and when they do, they live longer. When they live longer, they have more babies. More babies passes that trait on to others.